Happy weekend, ladies. I am so excited to be bringing you all of the incredible lessons for the Holy, Whole, and Fit devotional. And we are going to be walking through a couple of things that are going to help you with writing the personal writing portion of your devotions. As we walked through the different pieces that I presented in the sample devotion, you see you have your verse. Your verse was selected by you and approved by Kim to fall into various portions of the devotion. Then you have your personal writing. We're going to talk about why that personal writing in just a moment. After that, you have your God's truth. Then you have your prayer. And last but not least, that fifth piece is the journal questions and discussion piece. So today I'm going to give you an enhancer that might help you out a little bit with that personal writing piece. So let's talk a little bit about why you would want to even bring a personal writing piece in. Let's be honest, God's word is for everybody. Does it really matter how it applies to you? Well, let's talk about the Bible a little bit. So the Bible is actually written in three different types of language. And by that, I'm talking about the sort of like rhetorical strategy. That's what I mean by type of language. Like, how is the Bible written for our partaking in it? So the first way, of course, is literal. The Bible is written in a very literal way. It says what it means, and it means what it says. There's nothing hidden. I'm telling you this happened. Jesus rose from the dead. No, that is not a metaphor. Jesus actually rose from the dead. That's what I mean by literal. However, when you look at a lot of things that are literal, and you look at them outside of the historical context in which they took place, or outside of the cultural context in which they took place, suddenly these very literal black and white things can become foreign to us. The second way that the Bible is written is figurative. Figurative, obviously, just like it says, it's the opposite of literal. It's going to be when things are written in kind of a metaphor. Things are written not to be exact, but they're written as an example or an anecdote or an analogy for what happens for real. One of the ways to think about this is if you're looking at the comparison between the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the Old Testament, things that happened literally happen in the New Testament in this very spiritual way or this figurative way. For instance, even dying to yourself. In the Old Testament, you may have actually died, whereas in the New Testament, it's really more about dying to yourself in baptism or dying to those old ways so that you can rise again in your new self. Again, there's this figurative language, there's this literal language, and then last but not least, there's a poetic language. Our God, the same God who is the God of science and logic, is the God of passion and poetry and all of the arts. So, of course, some of the people that he tasked with writing, goodness knows, King David and all of the psalms that he created were written in a very poetic nature. You know, these are things that are just kind of beautiful to read. Again, filled with a lot of metaphor, filled with a lot of symbolism. But at the end of the day, they're poetic. Because of that, when you're looking at a verse, combine it with the translation that you're looking at. Then the brain has to figure out, okay, is God literally speaking to me? Is he figuratively speaking to me? Or is this a poetry from God that I have to somehow analyze and figure out? So all of a sudden, no matter how deep and wonderful and relatable and real the Bible still is, we find ourselves in this predicament going, I'm not quite sure I get it. And there are times that even those of us who've been reading the Bible for some time or studying it for some time, we find ourselves lost. And so digging in gets really intense, and sometimes that intensity can actually be confusing. Well, a devotion is literally all about digging into the Word. You're looking at these different verses, and you're going to help the reader see what is in those verses. You're going to help the reader apply those verses to his or her life. Because of that, we're going to assume that you've figured all this stuff out, and you're going to be able to present to the reader ways that that reader can relate more understandably to the verse that you have selected, whether it's for exercising your faith, nutrition of the word, rest of God, or the water of the Spirit. So you are going to take and make that high level, that Bible verse, those words of God, you're going to make them very relatable. And the way that you make your writing relatable is to make it personal, not necessarily to you, but to the reader. And there are two different ways to do that. They both achieve the same thing, but they are both very different approaches, believe it or not. The first is anecdote, and the second is analogy. Now, anecdote, that was my marker, excuse me. Anecdote is all about something that is from personal experience. Typically, this is going to be something from your own life, but it can also be from somebody that you know. So it's your life, someone close to you, their life. So it's about telling the story that you can see this verse alive in that person's life. Now, in an anecdote, because you're doing it from this me perspective, you're going to need to then follow it up with the you luring question. But before we get to that, let's talk about analogy. So analogy is a little bit different. As opposed to looking directly to your personal experiences, you're looking for something that's a universal understanding. So this is a world view. Now, mind you, you're not going to have something that can possibly relate to every single person in the world. So you're going to think in the context of the communities that you're in, the communities that you're trying to reach with this story. Remember, we talked about that a little bit in that first marketing section. So that's who you're really talking to in your worldview. It may not be every single person, but it's going to be the majority of people in that target market of yours can relate to this. And an analogy is really more something that's going to talk about, okay, let's picture what is it that God's talking about. So we're actually going into some of this poetic and this figurative. Even if God has not, we're using some of that poetic and figurative language to describe what God is saying. So guess what? Now we're speaking in God's languages. So an anecdote, unlike the figurative and poetic pieces, we're speaking in the literal pieces. So just like God speaks in 3 different languages, we are going to have those 3 languages that we can speak in when we're writing our devotion based on whether we are choosing anecdote or analogy. So that's the first thing that you need to understand, is that you're going to, in your personal writing, either speak anecdote or speak analogy. So let me go to what we have here. In the sample that I had written, I started with analogy. Excuse me, I'm lying. I started with anecdote. Anecdote is the one that I wrote. So let me read what this says, but then I'm going to break down exactly where I came to get to this point. So when I take on a new work project, I'm filled with inspiration around how to see the job through to success. I outline the plan, steps, schedule, and ultimate goals. Somewhere along the way, though, I start to run into little and not so little things that detour the project. Additional tasks I take on distract me from the important work I'm most passionate about. Other times, minor things like creative choices that weren't what I expected cause me to skip a step or trip. Just as often, I make a mistake or miss a deadline, so I simply stop, feeling overwhelmed or frustrated. I find it difficult to start moving again. It's easy in work and in life to lose track of the positives when we are busy dealing with distractions and detours. So that was my anecdote. So what you're seeing here is I've actually described my life in working. Now, For those of you who aren't following along in the sample devotional, I apologize. I should have read the verse again first. This was 1 Corinthians 9:24 through 27. In the ESV translation, it reads, "Do you know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified." So I looked at this verse literally as a race in life. And here I was talking about, and Paul in this, he was talking about things that can take us off course. He can talk about being disqualified. He can talk about beating at the air. Now, when I did my homiletics, I discussed and dug in, and I realized, hey, there's a lot of stuff here. There are little things and there are big things that can really distract us, but both of them take us away from God's path. So that's what I was thinking about when I came up with my anecdote, which was my personal work experience. But there's more to that. Those of you who know me, which even those of you who are just getting to know what I do for a living. I'm a writer. So when I was first thinking of this, I was thinking about like when I'm writing books, I come up with so many great ideas about how the story should turn out, but then I sometimes end up totally down a rabbit hole. It doesn't have anything at all to do with the story. And I end up chasing and writing all these, sometimes I'll write 20, 30 pages about something that doesn't even get used. And then the client ends up going a completely different direction. It throws me off. I get frustrated and I want to quit and stop the whole project. If I were to tell that story though, what tiny percentage of people am I actually going to be able to relate to in my anecdote? So here's what I did is I said, okay, well, what is writing? Writing is really my work. In this one, I also looked further and I talked about, okay, well, what is it when I have to write a chapter that's unused? That's not relatable to everybody. Again, remember, the whole purpose of anecdote and analogy is to make the devotion relatable and understood by everybody. So instead of talking about a chapter that was unused, what's something that everybody can relate to in their work? A creative choice that I didn't agree with. So now it doesn't matter whether I'm an engineer, a writer, a chef, a teacher. These are things that happen across a whole spectrum of jobs. Sure, it's possible that I'm not speaking to every single reader, but I'm speaking to multiple people. I'm getting broader and broader and broader. So here's what I need you to do when you're doing analogy. I want you to come up with a personal experience, or like I said, it could be an experience of somebody that's close to you. A very good friend of mine, and tell that person's story. It's okay. The principle is still the same. So you're basically going to start out, if you want to do if you want to do anecdote, it's all about using a real experience to try to show a time when that verse applied to life. Then you're going to take that real experience and put it at what I call that 10,000 foot level. This is the treetops. We don't see the weeds. Weeds are way down there, and weeds don't relate to everyone. So you're going to go to that 10,000 foot level, and you're going to say, okay, don't tell me specifically what's going on. Tell me what area this applies to. Well, this is in the area of work. Okay, now we're going to take those different things and we're going to continue to make them broader. Oh, we're talking about an unused chapter. In this case, it's a creative choice. Whatever it is, you're going to make it broader and broader and broader. I'm not saying you're making it untrue. I'm not saying you're making it vague. This is still quite specific, but it is specific in a very relatable way. So the other thing I want to talk to you about is, notice I have work here. Typically, your writing, everything that you're writing in a devotion is going to apply to a specific area of life. So that area is going to be your relationships, your work, your personal growth, in other words, like your walk with God, your personal improvement. So all of these different areas. And then within relationships, you might even get more specific. Within your work, you might get more specific. There's paid work, there's service work. They're both work for God, by the way. But paid work and service work. In relationships, we have, our intimate, like our spouse relationship or that significant other. We have our parent relationships. We have the relationship where we're a child. We have our friendships. We have the people that we're discipling to. We have our small group and our ministry. So think about which of those three areas, first of all, that big area is talking about. So is it my work area? Again, that means service area, as well as paid work area. Not all work is paid, but it's still work and it's still the purpose. So your work area, that means just your purpose area. Is it in your relationship area? And you can get a little bit more specific there. Or is it in your personal life? In other words, is it like you improvement or your relationship with God improvement? That's what this broad topic should be. And then once again, when you're getting into the really specifics of your story, make sure that you are making those broad as well. Next, we're going to move on to analogy. So anecdote was really all about telling something personal. It was an experience-based relatability writing for your reader. Analogy is more about that universal understanding. It's a little bit broader than an anecdote, no less true, no less relatable. It's just, as you're looking at 8 different verses, you might say, you know what? I don't necessarily have a specific story about this verse that's strong enough, but I certainly have enough know-how to describe the meaning of this verse. That is where analogy comes in. Again, analogy, this is going to be using that figurative and poetic languages of God. Our anecdote used the literal language of God. So I have an example that is not in the sample devotional, but if I were to do that same devotion, that same verse, and I chose to go with analogy instead, here is that analogy. Have you ever been in the middle of a great work week when your computer crashed and you lost your work? Maybe you've had the blessing of opportunity and on your way out the door, you couldn't find your keys. Lateness led to stress, which led to a lack of enjoyment. When little annoyances happen in the middle of big joys, it's like gnats on our race with God. We find ourselves wasting time swatting away things on the narrow path and unable to even see the prize at the finish line or take pleasure in the journey. Like Paul, we are wandering aimlessly or beating the air, using our energy on things that keep us from a joy-filled life on God's path. So I went to something universally understood, the computer crash. Who doesn't understand that? Again, if I had a whole story about a computer crashing, I could have told anecdote, but instead I was describing a whole bunch of things that figuratively were like gnats on the path. Again, I'm looking at that poetic and figurative language. I'm using an analogy. The analogy that I chose to go with here are gnats on our path with God. So that's sort of a universal understanding. Who hasn't walked through in May, one of those little swarms of mayflies or gnats? They are just so annoying. And that's exactly what I was trying to describe here. So using the languages of God, which are figurative and poetic, I was able to come up with an analogy by pulling in some of the things in life that are gnats. So the computer crashing, losing your keys, you're late. All these little things, little annoyances are like our gnats. So that's the analogy that I painted. Again, it's a universally understood. Notice how broad I went. I didn't say, have you ever been writing a book and it crashed, your computer crashed, and you lost like chapters and chapters? Well, you ladies know that you are in a pretty select group of people. Not everybody has sat down and written a book like you. So not everybody's going to relate to that. In fact, a very small percentage of people will relate to that. So again, we want to keep it big. We want to keep it up at that 10,000 foot level. But we are going with the universally understood worldview. And once again, we're kind of creating a picture of real life to imagery. We're using those figurative and poetic. The real life that I did is I talked about those everyday annoyances. The imagery was the gnats on the path. That's where your analogy comes in. So it's not necessarily a personal experience, but it's an experience that most people can relate to. So that's the difference between anecdote and analogy. And last but not least, I finish up either one with what temporary things are taking you away from God's permanent path. This is where we get into our you luring questions. And I want to be pretty specific about two words here. The word you. Notice how in the anecdote, you're starting at yourself, the reader. In this case, you're going from, yourself, the writer. In this case, you're going from writer to reader. Up here, you're starting at this worldview. Here, you're going from the world to the reader. The reader is the you we're trying to get. So you really need to look outside yourself, and it needs to be a question. The next part, so this is outside So when I'm saying outside yourself, remember that work that we did identifying your audience. That's who you're talking to. That's the you I mean. The next piece is the word luring. Now, if you have a fish on its lure and you just quick yank, you're going to lose it. So guess what? That's your yes and no questions. If you have a reader who's kind of swimming by and just sort of playing around in this book, and you give them a yes or no question, they're just biting and they keep swimming. That's it. They didn't even have to stop. They aren't drawn into your book at all. So the first rule of alluring questions is no yes or no questions. In other words, this has to be something that's an actual full answer. The second one, again, this one says, what temporary things are taking you away from God's permanent path? So the second piece is you want to pull to the verse. So you're not just luring them into the text, you're luring them directly back to the verse. So those words, temporary and permanent, they tie directly back to the verse. I didn't use the exact words of the verse. The verse used perishable and imperishable. However, you don't want to talk down to your audience. You can assume that they're going to figure that out. If they don't figure it out, there's something about it. When they're reading that question, they're going, oh, wait, now I have to think about it. It's luring them back into the text, meaning I'm going to choose words that are going to specifically somehow tie back to the verse so that they have to really kind of read through and think about it. So no yes or no, and pull back to the verse. So this is it. Your creative writing is your personal writing is very creative for you. It's going to include either an anecdote or an analogy. Very difficult in your word count to do both. You probably do not have enough space. So if you really can't decide and you love both these approaches, if I were you, do 4 of yours in anecdote and 4 of yours in analogy. It's totally fine. So whatever works for you, but anecdote, personal experience, 10,000 foot level, followed by a you luring question, in the literal God language. Analogy, a universally understood or a worldview circumstance. You're going to create a picture of real life compared to an imagery, followed by a luring question, and written in God's languages of figurative and poetic. That's anecdote and analogy. Good luck. You guys got a few more of these wonderful enhancers. Once again, these are enhancers. Everything you need to write, you have directly from your homiletics, which was the very first lesson and homework. So if you want to apply these, great. I hope you get an opportunity to use them. If not, don't stress and keep it your good work. Thanks. Have a great day.